the slow leaving of Earth, the first quiet steps. In the beginning, the future did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived slowly. It arrived with paperwork. It arrived with meetings, committees, budgets, delayed launches, and careful discussions about safety. Earth was still Earth. People still lived in cities. People still drove cars. People still argued about politics. People still watched movies. And yet, under all of that, there was a quiet, growing feeling that the planet was becoming too small. Not because Earth was physically shrinking, but because human ambition was growing. And also because Earth was becoming complicated. The oceans were warming. The air was changing. The weather became less predictable. The population continued rising. The global economy shifted again and again. And the idea that humanity should have a backup home began to sound less like science fiction and more like a serious plan. The first serious plans were boring. They were not heroic. They were not romantic. They were not dramatic. They were spreadsheets. They were engineering reports. They were international treaties. They were long debates about orbital debris. And they were long arguments about who would own the moon. The earliest colonies were not even colonies. They were simply stations. Orbital stations. Research habitats. Manufacturing platforms. They were placed above Earth like tiny floating islands. At first, they were designed for scientists. Then for workers. Then for mixed crews. Then slowly for families. The first true expansion was not Mars. It was orbit. Because orbit was close. Orbit was cheap compared to deep space. Orbit was a test. A slow test. A careful test. For years, humans learned how to recycle water. How to grow food in artificial soil. How to treat radiation exposure. How to repair machines in zero gravity. How to handle boredom in small metal rooms. How to sleep while the Earth rotated beneath them. The early stations became like little cities. Not big cities. Not exciting cities. But quiet, compact, functional ones. The first great orbital settlement was built in layers. Like a slow-growing coral reef. A module here. A new ring there. A new docking port. A new greenhouse. A new sleeping wing. A new medical lab. A new storage tank. It took decades. And because it took decades, people stopped noticing it. That is one of the strangest things about human history. The most important changes sometimes happen so slowly that nobody sees them. By the time the orbital settlements were truly self-sustaining, most people on Earth were not watching. They were busy. Busy with daily life. Busy with work. Busy with entertainment. Busy with ordinary problems. And so the first space communities were born quietly. They did not begin with flags. They began with routine. They began with schedules. They began with maintenance. They began with the hum of air filters. The hum of fans. The hum of oxygen systems. The hum of small machines keeping fragile humans alive. And in time, the moon became the next step. The moon was not chosen because it was beautiful. It was chosen because it was close. Because it had resources. Because it had stable ground. Because it had lava tubes. Because it had craters with frozen water. Because it was a natural laboratory. The first lunar settlements were ugly. They were gray. They were dusty. They were covered in protective layers. They were built partly underground. They were built in tubes and tunnels. They were built with regolith bricks. They were built with machines that could 3D print walls. They were designed not to inspire, but to survive. Lunar settlers lived in long corridors. They walked carefully. They worked slowly. They maintained everything. The moon did not forgive mistakes. A broken seal meant death. A torn suit meant death. A failed airlock meant death. And so the culture of lunar life became one of extreme caution. Lunar people were patient. They were careful. They were disciplined. And over time, they became different. Not biologically at first, but culturally. They spoke with different slang. They developed different humor. They valued silence. They valued efficiency. They valued calm. Earth people called them boring. Moon people called Earth people loud. And then Mars. Mars was always in the background. Mars was always in the dream. Mars was always the red symbol of the next great frontier. But Mars was not easy. Mars was far. Mars required long travel. Mars required huge supply chains. Mars required deep planning. And so the first Mars missions were slow. They were robotic at first. Then small human crews. Then larger crews. Then permanent bases. Then slowly a colony. Mars was not settled quickly. It was settled like an old town. One building at a time. One tunnel at a time. One greenhouse at a time. One reactor at a time. Mars colonists lived under domes, or under thick layers of soil. They grew plants under artificial lights. They drank recycled water. They breathed carefully processed air. They worked. They repaired. They expanded. They wrote reports. They recorded data. They did not live exciting lives. They lived careful lives. The first generation of Martian settlers did not call themselves pioneers. They called themselves employees, technicians, agronomists, geologists, engineers. And slowly, as the decades passed, the colonies became normal. Not normal to Earth people, but normal to the people living there. Children were born in orbit. Children were born on the moon. Children were born on Mars. And that is when the future became real. Because when children are born somewhere, that place becomes a home. And once a place becomes home, people stop thinking of it as an experiment. They stop thinking of it as a project. They stop thinking of it as a mission. They begin thinking of it as life. And life continues, even in the quiet, dusty corners of space. Crescent Moon, the quiet beginning of Forgotten Colonies. At first, all colonies were known. All colonies were tracked. All colonies were celebrated. Every new settlement was in the news. Every new dome was broadcast. Every new water source was announced. Every new baby born off Earth was recorded. But then more colonies were built, and the human population expanded, and the solar system began to fill with small, scattered communities. And that is when history began to change. Because history does not remember everything. History remembers what is loud. History remembers what is dramatic. History remembers what is political. History remembers what is violent. History forgets what is quiet. And many colonies were quiet. They were small. They were built for mining, for research, for manufacturing, for fuel production, for deep space navigation, for asteroid processing. And those colonies were not exciting. So they were not remembered. They were simply there, like forgotten towns on an old map, like abandoned rail stations in the desert, like silent islands no longer visited. They existed. They functioned. They worked. And then they faded. And so part 1 ends with the slow, careful truth. The future did not explode into being. It grew, quietly, boringly, and it began to spread outward. As the first great settlements became stable, the next era began. This was the era of small worlds. Not planets, not grand terraforming projects, not giant domes, but small habitats, built in places that most people never looked at. The asteroid belt became important, not because it was romantic, but because it was rich. Asteroids contained metals, rare elements, ice, carbon compounds, useful minerals, everything industry needed. At first, asteroid mining was remote, robotic, controlled from Earth, or controlled from Mars. But the distance was too great. Communication delays were annoying. Repair missions were expensive. And eventually, humans did what they always do. They moved closer to the work. They built stations, small rotating habitats, tiny spinning wheels. They provided artificial gravity. They provided radiation shielding. They provided sleeping quarters. They provided kitchens. They provided gyms. They provided medical rooms. And of course, they provided storage. The people who lived there were not heroes. They were workers. They were miners. They were mechanics. They were logistics managers. They were safety inspectors. They were cooks. They were nurses. They were teachers for the few children who arrived. And slowly, the asteroid belt became filled with human life. Not a lot of life. Not like a planet. But enough. Enough to form communities. Enough to form cultures. Enough to form identities. Some stations became famous. Most did not. Because most were small. Most were functional. Most were dull. And dull things are forgotten. The same happened in the outer solar system. Jupiter's moons. Saturn's moons. The ice moons. The research outposts. The fuel depots. The deep space relay stations. They were built for purpose, not for glory. And so they were never truly celebrated. The largest of these were the transfer colonies. Places where ships refueled. Places where crews rested. Places where cargo was processed. Places where old ships were dismantled. Places where new ships were assembled. They were the boring backbone of interplanetary life. Without them, nothing worked. But because they were boring, history rarely spoke about them. Then came the era of automated construction. Factories in orbit. Factories on the moon. Factories in asteroid zones. They could build habitat modules quickly. They could print walls. They could weld structures. They could assemble solar arrays. They could create pressure domes. And this changed everything. Because it meant colonies could be built faster than ever. And once colonies can be built quickly, they can also be abandoned quickly. That is the key. A colony is remembered when it is permanent. But when colonies become cheap, they become temporary. And temporary things disappear. So the solar system became filled with hundreds of settlements. Then thousands. Many were tiny. Some were only 50 people. Some were only 12. Some were only 3. Some were even fully automated, with only occasional human visits. But they were still colonies. Still outposts. Still human footprints in strange places. And then came the first major collapse. Not a collapse of humanity. Not a collapse of Earth. But a collapse of communication. A collapse of supply chains. A collapse of attention. Because Earth began to change. Earth began focusing inward. There were new crises, new political shifts, new wars, new economic changes, new technologies, new distractions. And slowly, Earth stopped caring about the far colonies. Not out of cruelty, but out of fatigue. People can only focus on so many things. And when Earth was busy, the distant colonies became background noise. Then, for the first time, a colony was truly lost. Not destroyed, not exploded, not dramatic, just lost. A small station in the belt failed to send its monthly report, then its weekly report, then its daily ping. At first, people assumed a transmitter problem. Then they assumed a power issue. Then they assumed a solar storm. Then they assumed the crew had evacuated. But when a rescue ship arrived months later, the station was silent. The lights were off. The airlocks were sealed. The interior was empty. No bodies. No damage. Just empty. The crew had left. They had taken a ship. They had gone somewhere. No official record existed. And nobody knew why. And that is when a strange new fear entered human space history. Not fear of aliens. Not fear of monsters. But fear of silence. Fear that a colony could simply vanish. Not in an explosion, but in quiet. And when it happens once, it can happen again. And it did. More colonies stopped reporting. More outposts went silent. More small habitats became abandoned. Sometimes for logical reasons. A mine ran dry. A reactor failed. A contract ended. A corporation went bankrupt. A political treaty changed. Sometimes the reason was tragic. A disease outbreak. A life support failure. A slow radiation poisoning. Sometimes the reason was unknown. A decision by the settlers. A secret departure. A quiet rebellion. A refusal to return. And so slowly, the solar system filled with ghosts. Not supernatural ghosts, but human ghosts. Stations with empty halls. Domes filled with dust. Hydroponic farms left to rot. Machines still running. Old warning lights blinking. Old computer logs repeating. And all of these places became the first forgotten future colonies. They were future, but they became history. And they were forgotten. As time passed, the colonies became more independent. At first, Earth controlled everything. Earth funded missions. Earth issued licenses. Earth approved construction. Earth set rules. Earth owned the biggest fleets. But slowly, that power shifted. Because Earth was far. And distance creates independence. Distance creates culture. Distance creates resentment. Distance creates new ways of living. Mars did not want to be managed like a remote worksite forever. The belt stations did not want to be treated like disposable mining camps. The lunar settlements did not want to follow Earth politics. And so a quiet divide began. Not with battles, not with declarations, but with small changes. A colony begins producing its own food. A colony begins building its own ships. A colony begins creating its own education systems. A colony begins printing its own laws. A colony begins trading directly with another colony. And then, one day, a colony stops paying Earth taxes, and Earth is too tired to enforce it. That is how empires fade. Not in fire, but in exhaustion. Then came the era of the Interplanetary Compact, a system meant to keep trade stable, keep peace, keep rules consistent. But the compact was boring. It was bureaucracy. It was committees. It was endless negotiation. And many colonies simply ignored it. And this created the conditions for the most important event in the history of the Forgotten Colonies: the communication fracture. It happened slowly. First, a few relay stations failed. Then, a few trade routes became unreliable. Then, a few colonies began encrypting their transmissions. Then, some colonies stopped broadcasting publicly. Then, Earth networks became incompatible with newer colonial networks. Then, political factions began interfering with signals. Then, solar storms damaged infrastructure. Then, repairs were delayed. Then, repairs were never done. And then, the web of human communication began to tear. Not completely, but enough. Enough that colonies became isolated. And when a colony is isolated, it becomes its own world. It becomes its own country. It becomes its own civilization. And it can be forgotten. Some colonies embraced isolation. They wanted peace. They wanted quiet. They wanted to live without constant oversight. They wanted to be left alone. Other colonies suffered. They depended on imports. They depended on medicine. They depended on spare parts. They depended on trade. And when the network broke, they collapsed. But even collapse was often quiet. A station runs out of oxygen filters. A farm loses power. A reactor shuts down. A crew evacuates. A ship departs. And the station becomes silent. No explosion. No cinematic ending. Just silence. The Great Divide created a solar system full of echoes. Echoes of voices in old logs. Echoes of songs recorded in crew quarters. Echoes of school lessons in abandoned classrooms. Echoes of old messages still looping in dead servers. And in the centuries that followed, explorers would find them, drifting, still intact, still holding human history inside. And yet nobody on Earth remembered their names. They were forgotten. By the time humans began exploring beyond the outer planets, the Forgotten Colonies had become legend. Not a legend of aliens. Not a legend of monsters. But a legend of lost people. Lost families. Lost communities. Lost worlds. New ships traveled farther. Faster. They carried better engines. Better shielding. Better automation. They could cross distances that earlier generations could not. And with these ships came a new kind of explorer. The archivist. Not a soldier. Not a conqueror. But a historian. A quiet traveler. A collector of lost records. They traveled to old coordinates. Old maps. Old signals. Old rumors. They searched for places that once held human life. And sometimes they found them. A dome on a moon, cracked but still standing. A station in the belt, slowly spinning. A greenhouse still filled with frozen plants. A schoolroom with chairs bolted to the floor. A wall covered in handwritten notes. And these discoveries were emotional. Not because they were loud, but because they were silent. Because silence is heavy. Silence feels like memory. Silence feels like grief. The archivists would enter these places carefully. They would restore power. They would access the logs. They would read the messages. And they would learn the truth. The Forgotten Colonies were not lost because of aliens. They were not lost because of supernatural forces. They were lost because humans are human. Because humans move on. Because humans forget. Because humans build faster than they remember. Because humans leave behind small communities when larger priorities appear. Because history is not kind to the quiet. Many colonies ended simply. A community voted to leave. A community decided to migrate to a better world. A community joined another colony. A community died slowly. A community became independent and changed its name. And after enough time, no one remembered the old name. No one remembered the old coordinates. No one remembered the old stories. And so the colonies became echoes. But there was one final discovery. One colony far beyond the usual routes. A place that had no reason to exist. A place built in deep space. Not on a planet. Not near an asteroid belt. Not near a moon. Just floating. A giant rotating habitat. Massive. Old. Quiet. The archivists called it Echo World. Its name in the logs was different, but no one could pronounce it anymore. Echo World was filled with rooms, filled with empty homes, filled with libraries, filled with workshops, filled with gardens. It had been built for thousands, and yet it was empty. The logs explained everything. Echo World was built by a group of settlers who did not want to live under any government. They did not want Earth. They did not want Mars. They did not want corporate control. They wanted quiet. They wanted peace. They wanted distance. And so they left. They built their own world. They lived there for generations. They became self-sustaining. They developed art. They developed traditions. They developed songs. They developed a calendar. They developed their own language. And then something happened. Not a disaster. Not a war. But a choice. They decided to leave. To go even farther. To travel beyond the solar system. They launched ships. They packed their history. They took their children. They took their culture. They took their future. And they left Echo World behind. They left it like an empty museum. They left it as a shell. A quiet monument. And nobody knew. Nobody followed. Nobody recorded it properly. And so Echo World drifted. For centuries. Until it was found again. And when it was found, humanity realized something deep. Something sleepy. Something quiet. Something almost sad. The future is not one story. It is many small stories. And many of those stories disappear. Not because they are unimportant, but because history is lazy. History is loud. History forgets. And the Forgotten Future Colonies were proof. Proof that humans had already spread far. Proof that humans had already built worlds. Proof that humans had already lived and died among the stars. And proof that even the greatest achievements can become silent, can become dust, can become a forgotten name on an old map. Hello and welcome. Tonight you're going to hear a very slow, very quiet, boring history. A history that feels like drifting, like floating, like looking out a window and watching distant lights. This is the story of Earth's Forgotten Future Colonies, the places humans built, far away, the places humans lived, and then the places humans slowly forgot. So get comfortable. Let your eyes relax. Let your breathing slow. And let's begin. Long ago, Earth was still busy, still loud, still full of daily life. People went to work. People argued. People built. People bought things. People cooked dinner. And most people did not think about space. Not seriously. Not every day. But somewhere quietly. The first steps were happening. Not dramatic steps. Not heroic steps. But careful steps. Boring steps. Steps made of budgets, engineering reports, and endless meetings. The first colonies were not on Mars. The first colonies were not on the Moon. The first colonies were above Earth. In orbit. Because orbit was close. Orbit was practical. Orbit was a test. The early orbital stations were small. They were narrow. They were filled with cables, with air filters, with pipes, with blinking lights. And they were filled with routine. People woke up. They checked oxygen levels. They checked water recycling. They checked pressure seals. They repaired small machines. They cleaned. They recorded data. They ate. They slept. And they did this every day. The station slowly grew, one module at a time, like an old building, being expanded over decades. And after many years, those stations became something else. Not just stations, but neighborhoods, little floating neighborhoods, with kitchens, with medical rooms, with greenhouses, and quiet sleeping quarters. And then, after orbit, came the Moon. The Moon was not welcoming. It was dusty, gray, cold, silent. But it was close, and it had resources. Ice and shadowed craters, lava tubes, stable ground. The first lunar settlements were built for survival, not beauty, not comfort. People lived underground or beneath thick shielding. They worked slowly. They moved carefully. Because the Moon did not forgive mistakes. And slowly, Moon culture began to form. The Moon people became calm and careful. They spoke softly. They valued silence. They valued routine. And then, Mars. Mars took longer. Mars required patience, long travel, long supply chains, long planning. The first Mars bases were small, just a few rooms, under domes, or under soil. And the settlers worked, repaired, expanded. They were not heroes. They were employees, technicians, engineers, agronomists. And then, something happened. Something quiet. Something important. Children were born off Earth. Children were born in orbit. Children were born on the Moon. Children were born on Mars. And when children are born somewhere, that place becomes home. And once a place becomes home, people stop thinking of it as a mission. They begin thinking of it as life. And so, humanity began to spread. Quietly, boringly, slowly, into the dark. And that is where part 1 begins and ends. Because the future did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived with routine. And now, we drift forward. The solar system becomes filled with small places, Small habitats, small stations, small communities. With not planets, not giant cities, but small worlds. With as the moon and Mars became stable, human industry looked outward, toward the asteroid belt. With the asteroid belt was not beautiful. It was not romantic. It was useful. With it contained metals, ice, carbon, rare elements. With at first, robots mined the asteroids. With but robots broke, and distance was expensive. With so humans did what they always do. With they moved closer. With they built small stations near the work. With the stations were functional. They were not grand. They were like work camps in deep space. With inside, life was slow and repetitive. With a miner woke up, checked the schedule, put on a suit, went out to work, returned, cleaned equipment, ate food, and slept. With over and over. With and slowly, the belt filled with hundreds of habitats. With some held 50 people, some held 20, some held 10. With some were only visited once every few months. With they were quiet and boring, and that is why history began to forget them. With because history does not remember the quiet places. With then, the outer solar system began to receive outposts. With research bases, fuel depots, relay stations. With small settlements near icy moons. With not because people loved the cold, but because the cold contained water, and water meant fuel, life, and trade. With for a while, everything was tracked. Every station, every dome, every habitat. With but then, there were too many. With the number grew, and grew, and grew. With and that is when the first colony went silent. With not in an explosion, not in a war, not in a dramatic ending. With it simply stopped responding. With the monthly report did not arrive. With the weekly ping did not arrive. With the daily check-in did not arrive. With and when a ship finally visited, months later, with the station was intact. With the airlocks were sealed. With the lights were off. With and the halls were empty. With no bodies, no damage, no signs of struggle. With just emptiness. With the crew had left. With they had taken a ship and disappeared. With and nobody knew why. With and once it happened once. With it happened again. With more stations went silent. With more outposts became abandoned. With some for logical reasons. A mine ran dry. A company collapsed. A contract ended. With some for tragic reasons. A disease. A slow failure. A life support breakdown. With and some for no clear reason at all. With and so, the solar system gained its first ghosts. With not supernatural ghosts. With but human ghosts. With quiet halls, dusty rooms, old logs, old messages. With the echo of human life. And as you listen, your mind can drift. Because part 2 is not loud. Part 2 is simply the slow spreading of small worlds and the slow beginning of forgetting. And now, we move gently, is where distance begins to change people. At first, Earth controlled everything. Earth funded missions. Earth wrote the rules. Earth managed trade. Earth approved construction. But Earth was far away. And distance creates independence. Distance creates culture. Distance creates new habits. Mars began to feel less like a project and more like a home. The belt stations began to feel less like work camps and more like towns. And the moon settlements began to feel like their own world. So slowly, quietly, the colonies changed. They grew their own food. They printed their own parts. They built their own ships. They taught their own children. They wrote their own laws. And one day, a colony stopped paying Earth taxes. And Earth did not respond. Not because Earth was weak, but because Earth was tired. That is how control ends. Not with fire, but with fatigue. Then came the Interplanetary Compact, a system meant to keep peace and keep trade stable. It was made of committees and meetings and paperwork, and many colonies ignored it. And then the communication web began to break. At first, a relay station failed. Then another. Then another. Then solar storms damaged equipment. Then repairs were delayed. Then repairs were never done. Some colonies began encrypting signals. Some stopped broadcasting. Some upgraded their networks until Earth systems could no longer read them. And slowly, the solar system became quieter, less connected, more isolated. Some colonies liked it. They wanted silence. They wanted peace. They wanted freedom. Other colonies suffered. They needed medicine. They needed spare parts. They needed trade. And when the network fractured, they collapsed. But even collapse was often quiet. A station runs out of filters. A greenhouse loses power. A reactor shuts down. A crew evacuates. A ship departs. And the station becomes silent. In the centuries that followed, these places became echoes. Echoes in old data logs. Echoes in recorded voices. Echoes in looping messages. Echoes of children learning lessons in classrooms that would never again hear laughter. And so part 3 is the Great Quiet Divide. The moment humanity stopped being one story and became many small stories. Some remembered, some forgotten. And now we drift into part 4. #Part 4, Echoes of Lost Worlds. Narration script sleepy. Part 4 is where the future becomes history. And the Forgotten Colonies become a kind of legend. Not a legend of aliens, not a legend of monsters, but a legend of lost people. As technology improved, ships traveled farther, faster, more safely. And with these ships came a new kind of traveler. Not a soldier, not a conqueror, not a miner, but an archivist, a quiet explorer, whose job was to find old places and collect their stories. The archivists followed old coordinates, old rumors, old broken signals, old maps, and sometimes they found something, a cracked dome on a distant moon, a spinning habitat in the belt, a greenhouse filled with frozen plants, a kitchen with plates still bolted down, a bedroom with a child's drawing still stuck to the wall. And the archivists moved carefully. They restored power. They opened logs. They read messages. And they learned the truth. The Forgotten Colonies were not lost to aliens. They were not destroyed by cosmic horror. They were lost because humans are human. Humans build and move on. Humans forget. Humans leave quiet places behind. Because history remembers loud things. History remembers war. History remembers politics. History remembers explosions. But history does not remember a small station with 30 workers living quietly in a metal ring. So the colonies faded. Some communities voted to migrate. Some joined larger settlements. Some died slowly. Some changed their names. And after enough time, no one remembered the old name. Then the archivists found one final place, a massive habitat, drifting in deep space, not near a planet, not near a moon, not near a trade route, just floating. It was enormous. It was built for thousands, and it was empty. The logs called it something old, something difficult to pronounce. But the archivists gave it a simple name. Echo World. Echo World had homes, libraries, gardens, schools, workshops. It had been lived in for generations. And then the people had left. Not in panic, not in war, but in a decision. They wanted to go farther, beyond the solar system. They packed their history. They took their children. They boarded ships. And they left Echo World behind. Like an empty museum. An Echo World drifted for centuries until it was found again. And when it was found, humanity understood a quiet truth. The future is not one story. It is many small stories. And many of those stories fade into silence. With the Forgotten Future Colonies were proof. With proof that humans had spread. With proof that humans had built worlds. With proof that humans had lived and loved and worked and grown old among the stars. With and proof that even great achievements can become dust. With and so, as your breathing slows, with as your eyes grow heavy, with remember this quiet ending. With the future is not always bright. With sometimes the future is silent. With sometimes the future is forgotten. With and sometimes the future becomes an echo. Good night, hello, and welcome. Tonight, you are going to listen to a very long, very quiet, very boring history. A history that does not rush. A history that does not shout. A history that does not try to impress you. It simply moves slowly, like a ship drifting through a dark and gentle sea. This is the story of Earth's forgotten future colonies, the small worlds that humans built in orbit, on the moon, on Mars, and far beyond, the places that once held air, light, food, voices, and ordinary lives, the places that became home, the places that became routine, the places that became quiet, and then the places that became forgotten. So, before we begin, take a slow breath and let it out. Relax your shoulders. Let your hands rest. Let your jaw loosen. Let your eyes soften. You don't have to concentrate. You don't have to remember everything. You can simply listen and drift. With long ago, before the solar system was filled with stations, before the moon had tunnels, before Mars had domes, Earth was still the center, not just the center of gravity, not just the center of culture, but the center of attention. Almost everything still happened on Earth. People woke up and checked their phones. They watched the weather. They worried about work. They cooked meals. They argued about politics. They made jokes. They paid bills. They went to school. They fell in love. They got tired. They went to sleep. And most people did not think about space. Not deeply. Not every day. Space was something that existed in documentaries, in movies, in video games, in old dreams. It was something far away, something beautiful, something distant, something optional. But slowly, very slowly, space stopped being optional. Not because Earth suddenly exploded, not because the oceans boiled, not because the skies turned black. No, the change was boring. The change was gradual. The change was the kind of change that happens in spreadsheets, in budgets, in meetings, in quiet decisions. The future did not arrive like a meteor. It arrived like a slow tide. And one of the first signs was not a rocket. It was a conversation that repeated year after year, in different rooms, in different languages, In different countries, the conversation was simple. What happens if Earth cannot carry everything forever? What happens if a supply chain breaks? What happens if a war disrupts food? What happens if a climate pattern shifts? What happens if a disease spreads? What happens if the population rises? What happens if technology demands more rare metals, more energy, more space? What happens if the planet becomes crowded, not just crowded with people, but crowded with needs, crowded with complexity, crowded with pressure, crowded with systems that all depend on each other? And so, a phrase became common, a phrase that sounded dramatic, but was usually said in boring voices: a backup plan, a second home, a multi-planetary future. People said it in conferences. People said it in press releases. People said it in government reports. People said it in corporate presentations. And at first, many people laughed, not because it was impossible, but because it sounded like science fiction. And science fiction was something people enjoyed after dinner, not something they expected to become real. But as the decades passed, and technology improved, and launch costs fell, and automation increased, the idea stopped sounding like fantasy and started sounding like policy, like strategy, like insurance. And insurance is a very boring thing. Insurance does not thrill you. Insurance does not inspire you. Insurance is paperwork. Insurance is planning. Insurance is caution. And that is exactly how humanity entered space. In the beginning, not with romance, but with caution. The earliest expansion was not Mars. It was not the moon. It was orbit. Because orbit was close. Orbit was cheap. Orbit was manageable. Orbit was the first step that could be repeated again and again without enormous risk. The first orbital habitats were not beautiful. They were not like the shiny stations in old movies. They were practical. They were modular. They were full of wires. They were full of pipes. They were full of storage. They smelled like metal, like plastic, like recycled air. They had the constant hum of fans, the constant whisper of air moving, the constant soft vibration of machines, keeping people alive. And in those early days, life in orbit was mostly work. Work and routine. Work and maintenance. Work and checklists. Work and careful procedures. Astronauts, engineers, technicians, medical officers, and researchers did not spend their days floating romantically in slow motion. They spent their days fixing things, tightening bolts, cleaning filters, repairing seals, checking pressure, checking temperature, checking radiation exposure. They spent their days making sure that tomorrow would still have air and water and light. The first stations were small, a few modules docked together. Then, more modules, then a new ring, then a new lab, then a new greenhouse, then a new storage bay, then a new sleeping section, then a new docking port. And this process did not take weeks. It took decades, because building in orbit was slow, it was expensive, it was complicated, it required planning, it required transport, it required international agreements, it required corporate contracts, it required safety reviews, it required budgets, and budgets move slowly. Budgets are sleepy. Budgets do not like surprises. Budgets prefer predictability. And so, the first great orbital settlement was not built in a single heroic push. It was built piece by piece, like a town, built by patient hands, over a long time. And one day, without any dramatic announcement, people realized that the station was no longer a temporary outpost. It was a community. It had permanent residents. It had people who had lived there for years. It had a rhythm, a schedule, a culture. It had rules and traditions and jokes that only made sense to the people living there. The station had a cafeteria where people ate together. It had a small gym where people exercised to keep their bones strong. It had quiet sleeping pods. It had medical rooms. It had storage rooms filled with supplies. It had greenhouses with plants. Plants were important, not just for oxygen, not just for food, but for the mind. A human living in metal corridors needs something green, something alive, something that grows slowly. Plants were a kind of therapy. In the earliest days, a few leaves were enough to make people feel less lonely, less trapped, less distant from Earth. And slowly, the orbital settlement became a place where families could visit. At first, only short visits, then longer ones, then a few people stayed, then a few children arrived, not born yet, but brought. Children were carefully monitored. Children were studied. Doctors and scientists wanted to know if children could grow in lower gravity, if their bones would develop properly, if their hearts would adapt, if their minds would remain healthy. The first children in orbit became famous. For a while, news articles, documentaries, interviews, they were called the first generation of space children. But fame is short, and after a few years, Earth became distracted again. New trends, new crises, new entertainment, new politics, and orbit returned to being background noise, even as it grew, even as it became more important. This is one of the strangest truths about human history. The most important changes often happen while people are looking somewhere else. And then, the moon. The moon was always there, hanging in the sky, like an old friend, like a silent witness. Humans had walked on it, long ago, in earlier centuries. But those visits were brief, symbolic, and then humanity returned to Earth and spent many decades arguing and forgetting. But now, in this slow future, the moon returned as a practical place, a place to build, a place to mine, a place to test, a place to store, a place to launch. The moon had one great advantage. It was close, close enough that a supply ship could arrive in days, not months, close enough that emergency missions were possible, close enough that the moon could serve as a stepping stone to Mars and beyond. The first lunar bases were not built to impress anyone. They were built to survive. The moon is harsh. The moon has no air, no weather, no warmth, no natural protection. Radiation hits the surface. Micrometeorites strike. Dust clings to everything. The temperature swings between extremes. And so, the first lunar settlements were built under shielding. Some were built inside lava tubes, long underground tunnels formed by ancient volcanic activity. Some were built in trenches and covered with thick layers of regolith, moon soil, moon dust, moon rubble. It was used like a blanket, a heavy blanket, to block radiation, to protect against impacts, to stabilize temperature. Inside, the lunar corridors were narrow. The lighting was soft. The air was dry. The walls were practical. Every surface was designed to be cleaned easily. Because lunar dust was everywhere. Lunar dust was sharp, abrasive, dangerous to lungs, dangerous to machines. Lunar settlers became very careful people. They did not rush. They did not slam doors. They did not waste oxygen. They did not waste water. They did not waste power. Their culture was built on caution. A lunar person learned early that mistakes were expensive and sometimes fatal. And so, they learned to be quiet, to be methodical, to be patient. Their humor became dry. Their speech became measured. They valued routine. They valued maintenance. They valued order. Earth people sometimes called them cold or boring, but moon people often thought Earth people were noisy, chaotic, and wasteful. And so, even before Mars, humanity began to divide into subtle cultural groups, not because they wanted to, but because environments shape people, and the moon shaped people into quiet survivors. The moon settlements expanded slowly. At first, they were scientific outposts. Then, they became industrial hubs. The moon had resources: helium-3, rare metals, water ice, useful minerals. And because the moon had low gravity, It was easier to launch cargo from the moon than from Earth. The moon became a shipping point, a fuel depot, a construction yard, a place where ships could be assembled in large dry docks without fighting Earth's atmosphere and gravity. And slowly, the moon became a working world, not a world of romance, but a world of labor, a world of shifts and schedules and careful checklists, a world where people lived under artificial lights and measured time, not by sunrise, but by clocks. Because on the moon, the day is long, the night is long, and human bodies still need a stable rhythm. So lunar settlements created artificial days, artificial mornings, artificial evenings, artificial weekends. They celebrated holidays, not based on seasons, but based on tradition, based on memory, based on Earth's old calendar. Some settlements kept Earth time, others created lunar time. Some followed a strict schedule, others became more relaxed. But all of them shared one thing: they lived inside protected spaces, and so their world was always indoors. Their sky was always a ceiling. Their horizon was always a corridor. And this made their minds different. They learned to enjoy small things: a cup of warm tea, a conversation, a new plant sprouting, a small celebration, a quiet movie night. Because big experiences were rare, the moon was not a place for adventure. It was a place for patience. And then Mars. Mars was always the dream. Mars was always the symbol, the red planet, the distant frontier, the place where humanity would prove itself, the place where people imagined cities under domes and farms under artificial skies, and a new world built from scratch. But Mars was not easy. Mars was far. Mars required long travel. Mars required heavy shielding. Mars required large cargo missions. Mars required enormous planning. Mars required a kind of patience that only governments and long-term corporations could afford. At first, Mars missions were robotic, then small human crews, then larger crews, then permanent bases, then, slowly, a colony. Mars bases began as clusters of modules, connected by tunnels. They were buried under soil or protected by thick walls. They had greenhouses with artificial lights. They had water recycling. They had air processing. They had radiation shielding. They had emergency shelters. They had medical bays. They had storage, and storage, and more storage. Because on Mars, you cannot run to a store. If something breaks, you must fix it. If you cannot fix it, you must improvise. And so, Martian settlers became inventive, not in a romantic way, but in a practical way. They learned to repair machines with limited tools. They learned to recycle materials. They learned to repurpose parts. They learned to patch things. They learned to live with small imperfections. Because perfection was not possible in such a harsh environment, the first Martian settlers were not called pioneers. They were called specialists, technicians, engineers, geologists, agronomists, medical officers, communications experts, psychologists, logistics managers. They were employees. They were contracted. They were trained. They were carefully selected. Mars was not a place for impulsive dreamers. Mars was a place for stable people, patient people, people who could handle boredom and routine and long periods without fresh air, without natural sunlight, without open skies. The Martian day was similar to Earth, but slightly longer. And Martians adapted. They developed their own schedules, their own work rhythms. They began to feel that Mars was not a temporary job site. It was a home, but that took time. It took decades. It took children, because the first settlers still thought of themselves as visitors. They still thought they might return. They still thought their lives were tied to Earth. Then, the first children were born, not just in orbit, not just on the moon, but on Mars. And when a child is born, the adults change. Suddenly, they are not just maintaining a station. They are building a society. They are not just surviving. They are creating schools, health systems, family spaces, play areas, quiet parks under domes. They begin to think about long-term comfort, about art, about culture, about stories, about community. And slowly, Mars became a true colony, not a mission, not a project, a colony, a place where people lived and grew old and buried their dead and celebrated birthdays and argued about rules and formed friendships and fell in love and had ordinary lives. And this is where history becomes interesting, but still very quiet, because the first great truth of human space expansion is that it was boring. The future did not arrive in one dramatic moment. It arrived in maintenance schedules. It arrived in slow construction. It arrived in routine. It arrived in the steady hum of air filters. It arrived in the soft click of doors sealing. It arrived in the gentle glow of greenhouse lights. It arrived in the careful voice of a technician reading a checklist. And while this was happening, Earth continued to be Earth. Earth still had cities, still had oceans, still had storms, still had markets, still had fashion, still had entertainment, still had daily life. Most people still lived and died without ever leaving the planet. And for a long time, space colonies were a curiosity, a distant project, something talked about, but not felt. But then, as orbital settlements expanded, As lunar industry grew, as Martian colonies stabilized, space became economically important, not just symbolically, but practically. Factories in orbit began manufacturing materials that were difficult to make on Earth. Zero gravity allowed. Perfect crystals, advanced alloys, unique pharmaceuticals. Orbital shipyards began assembling large vessels. Lunar mining provided materials and fuel. Martian research produced new knowledge and new technology. And slowly, Earth's economy became linked to space, not fully, but enough that people started paying attention. Again, briefly, and then, as always, attention drifted because Earth had endless distractions. One of the strangest developments was the rise of space corporations. They were not romantic. They were not heroic. They were boring. They were businesses. They issued stock. They hired accountants. They managed risk. They created safety regulations. They fought lawsuits. They negotiated contracts. They competed for resources. They built infrastructure and demanded profit. The future was not built only by governments. It was built by corporations, by consortiums, by partnerships, by investors, by committees. It was built by people who wanted returns and stability and long-term growth. And so, the first space colonies were shaped not only by science, but by economics. A settlement was approved if it had purpose, if it could mine something, if it could produce something, if it could serve as a relay, if it could function as a depot, if it could become a hub. Very few colonies were built just because people wanted to live there. At first, most colonies were tools for industry, tools for research, tools for trade. And because they were tools, they were treated like tools, disposable, replaceable, expandable. And that is important because it explains why the Forgotten Colonies would later exist. If a colony is a tool, and the tool stops being useful, it is set aside, it is abandoned, it is replaced. And so, even in the early days, the seeds of forgetting were planted. The orbital settlements expanded into multiple stations. Not just one, but many. Some were research hubs. Some were manufacturing centers. Some were tourist stations. Yes, tourism arrived. Quietly. At first, a few wealthy people paid for short trips. They floated, took photos, looked at Earth, and returned. Tourism was expensive and highly controlled, but it created a new cultural shift. It made space feel less distant. It made space feel like something ordinary people might someday experience. And slowly, as costs fell, space tourism expanded. Not massively, but steadily. And orbital settlements added hotels, viewing lounges, restaurants, quiet entertainment spaces. But even then, everything remained controlled, and careful, because space is dangerous. Space does not forgive mistakes. And so, even leisure, in orbit, was cautious. With the moon also gained small tourist zones. People visited to see Earth rise, to walk in low gravity, to experience the silence. But tourism was always secondary. The moon's main role remained industrial. With Mars remained distant and difficult. Only the most committed and the most trained went there, and for a long time, Mars remained a place where people worked and lived and sometimes died, far from Earth. As the decades passed, a new kind of ship became common, the interplanetary cargo ship. Slow, heavy, automated, these ships carried food, spare parts, equipment, and people between Earth, the Moon, and Mars. They moved along predictable routes, like slow trains, moving through a dark ocean. They were not glamorous. They were functional, and their schedules were planned years in advance, because everything in space requires patience. By the time the first century of expansion ended, the solar system was no longer empty. It had rings of satellites, clusters of stations, moon tunnels, Martian domes, and yet, to most people on Earth, it still felt distant. It still felt like something happening far away, something they did not touch, something they did not smell, something they did not feel. And that distance allowed forgetting, because what people do not feel, they do not remember. But there was another reason the Forgotten Colonies would exist, and that reason was boredom. Not boredom in the sense of being lazy, but boredom in the sense of routine. Because when a colony becomes stable, it becomes ordinary. And when it becomes ordinary, it stops being news. It stops being exciting. It stops being recorded carefully. It becomes just another place, like a small town on an old highway. People still live there. People still work. People still eat dinner. People still go to sleep. But nobody makes documentaries about it. Nobody writes headlines about it. Nobody remembers when it changes. And so, the first colonies slowly slipped from the spotlight, even as they grew. Now, let us drift a little deeper into the quiet details of what it meant to live in the earliest colonies, because the Forgotten Colonies were not forgotten. In the beginning, they were simply new, and new things are watched. But once the novelty fades, only the people living there remember. In orbit, life had a rhythm. People woke up and checked systems. They checked oxygen, water, power. They ate breakfast, usually simple, packaged food, and small fresh greens from the greenhouse. They worked for many hours. They repaired. They cleaned. They inspected. They exercised. Because without exercise, bones weaken, muscles shrink, and health declines. Exercise was not optional. It was a rule. It was routine. It was boring. And then they ate again. They talked. They wrote messages. They recorded logs. They slept in sleeping pods with soft straps so they would not drift. They dreamed, sometimes of Earth, sometimes of nothing, sometimes of floating, even in their sleep. They lived with a constant awareness that outside the walls there was vacuum, cold, radiation, and silence. But over time, that awareness became background. It became normal. Humans can adapt to almost anything if the systems work, if the routine holds, if the air keeps flowing. Even space can become ordinary. On the moon, life was slower because movement in suits was slower and because everything had to be planned. A lunar worker might spend hours preparing for a short excursion, checking suit seals, checking oxygen tanks, checking tools, checking communication systems, then walking slowly through dust, performing tasks, returning, cleaning dust, repairing equipment. The lunar day was not measured by sunrise, but by schedule. The settlements created artificial time, artificial mornings, artificial evenings. People ate meals under soft lights. They celebrated small events. They watched movies. They played games. They read books. They grew plants. They maintained machines. They slept and repeated. This repetition was the foundation of survival. On Mars, life was even more complex because Mars was farther and because the colony had to be more self-sufficient. Martian settlers grew more food, recycled more water, manufactured more parts. They studied the soil. They tested radiation levels. They expanded tunnels. They built new domes. They created small parks. They built schools. They taught children. They wrote laws. They argued. They held elections. They formed committees. Yes, even in space, humans formed committees. Because humans love committees. They love meetings. They love rules. They love structure. And structure is comforting in a dangerous environment. And so, by the time the first great era ended, humanity had done something quietly extraordinary. They had built multiple homes. They had created multiple communities. They had created the beginning of a multi-world civilization. But it was still fragile, still dependent, still connected, still linked to Earth. And that connection would shape everything that came next. Because as long as Earth remained the center, the colonies remained extensions. But as distance grew, and as colonies became self-sufficient, that relationship would change. And when it changed, some colonies would be remembered, and some would fade. But that is later. That belongs to part 2. The Age of Small Were. LDS. the age of asteroid stations, the age of scattered habitats, the age when there were too many colonies for history to hold in its mind. For now, in Part 1, we remain in the early era, the slow leaving, the careful leaving, the leaving that did not feel like leaving, because it happened so gradually. Now, let us drift into another quiet detail, the emotional life of early colonists, because space was not only technical, it was psychological. The early settlers had to accept that they would not walk outside without a suit. They had to accept that they could not feel wind. They could not smell rain. They could not hear birds. They could not sit under a tree. They could not swim in an ocean. They could not stand in open sunlight without glass or shielding. Their world was filtered. Their world was artificial. And at first, this felt strange. Some settlers felt lonely. Some felt trapped. Some felt homesick. Some felt calm. Some felt proud. Some felt nothing. Because humans react differently to isolation. But over time, the settlers developed new comforts. They developed new rituals. A morning coffee in a viewing lounge, looking down at Earth. A quiet walk through a greenhouse, touching leaves. A weekly movie night. A monthly celebration. A shared meal. A small birthday party. A holiday where everyone wore something silly. Even in the most serious colonies, humans found ways to be human, because being human is not optional. It is what we are. The first settlers also developed a deep respect for systems. On Earth, people often ignore the infrastructure that keeps them alive. They do not think about water pipes, electricity grids, air quality, food supply chains. They take these things for granted. But in a colony, you cannot take anything for granted. Every breath depends on machines. Every sip of water depends on filters. Every meal depends on careful planning. Every light depends on power. Every mistake has consequences. And so, colonists became more aware, more grateful, more cautious, and that shaped their culture. It made them less wasteful, less impulsive, more patient, more disciplined. And this is part of the reason colonial cultures would later differ from Earth culture, because Earth culture was still built on abundance. Even when Earth struggled, it still had air and oceans and forests and gravity. Colonies did not have that. Colonies had machines and walls and routines. And routines create a certain kind of person. Now, as Part 1 continues, we move toward the moment when the solar system begins to expand beyond the main three: orbit, the Moon, and Mars. Because once these places became stable, humans looked outward toward resources, toward trade, toward industry. And that is when the seeds of forgetting truly began. But before we reach that, we must mention one more quiet thing that made everything possible: automation. What? Automation was not glamorous. Automation was not heroic. Automation was software, robots, drones, factory systems, repair machines, 3D printers, AI scheduling systems, AI monitoring systems, AI diagnostics, AI navigation, AI construction. Without automation, the colonies could not expand because humans are expensive and fragile and require air and water and food. Robots do not require these things. Robots can work in vacuum. Robots can work in radiation. Robots can work without rest. And so, automation became the silent workforce of the colonies. In orbit, robots cleaned surfaces, inspected hulls, repaired panels. In lunar mines, robots dug, carried, sorted. In Martian construction, robots printed walls, assembled modules, laid cables, checked seals. And as automation improved, colonies became easier to build, cheaper, faster, more numerous. And that is the key, because once colonies became easy, they became less precious, less unique, less remembered. A colony built slowly, over decades, is cherished. A colony printed quickly, in months, can be replaced. And replacement is the beginning of forgetting. But still, in the early era, colonies were rare and valuable. They were carefully recorded. They were celebrated. They were monitored. Every station had a name. Every settlement had a registry. Every habitat had a list of residents. Every supply shipment had a manifest. Every child born off Earth was recorded, because the idea was still new, still exciting, still historic. But that would not last, because humans cannot stay excited forever. Humans adapt. Humans normalize. Humans move on. Now, as you listen, you may notice that this history is not filled with battles. It is not filled with dramatic heroes. It is filled with ordinary people, because that is what colonies were. They were not built by legends. They were built by workers, technicians, engineers, farmers, teachers, nurses, cooks, mechanics, administrators. Yes, administrators. Even in space, there were administrators. There were people whose job was paperwork, scheduling, inventory, compliance, safety inspections, legal documentation. And those people were as important as the engineers, because without organization, a colony fails. And so, the future was built by boring professions. And that is why this is a boring history, because the truth is that the future is mostly administration. Now, we will drift toward the end of part 1, where the solar system begins to feel like a network, not just a few isolated settlements. Because once you have orbit, and the moon, and Mars, you have routes, trade, communication, movement. You have a system, and systems are fragile. Systems can grow and then break. And when systems break, some parts are remembered and some parts are lost. By the time the first century of expansion ended, the orbital settlements had become multiple stations connected by regular traffic. The moon had several major settlements and many smaller outposts. Mars had at least one main colony and a handful of research bases. Cargo ships traveled between them, following predictable windows. Tourists visited. Occasionally, scientists moved between worlds. Workers rotated in long contracts. Some people returned to Earth. Some stayed. Some never came back. And gradually, a new kind of identity formed. Not just Earth citizen, but orbital resident, lunar resident, Martian resident. These identities were subtle, but real, because when you live somewhere for years, you begin to feel that you belong there, even if the walls are metal, even if the sky is artificial. Belonging is not about nature. Belonging is about routine, about people, about memory. And so, part 1 ends with a quiet truth. The future did not begin with a grand declaration. It began with routine. And once routine exists, life exists. And once life exists, history begins. Now, take another slow breath and let it out, because part 2 will expand outward into the asteroid belt, into the scattered habitats, into the small worlds that were built and then quietly left behind. But for now, part 1 ends here in the early era, when everything was still, connected, still recorded, still remembered. And now, we drift into silence. For a moment, hello again, and welcome back. If you are still awake, that is completely okay. You don't need to force sleep. You can simply listen and let your mind drift, like a slow ship, moving gently through a quiet sea. In part 1, we watched humanity leave Earth, slowly, carefully, boringly. We saw orbital stations become neighborhoods. We saw the moon become a working world. We saw Mars become a true colony. And we ended in an era where everything was still connected, still monitored, still recorded, still remembered. But in part 2, the solar system expands in a different way, not with grand planets, not with heroic city domes, but with small worlds, tiny habitats, industrial outposts, fuel depots, relay stations, mining rings, research bubbles, and rotating wheels. The age of small worlds was the age when humanity built more colonies than it could remember. And that is when forgetting began. Now, take a slow breath and let it out. Let your shoulders soften. Let your thoughts become lighter. And we will begin. The shift began with industry. It always begins with industry. Because industry is patient. Industry is repetitive. Industry does not care about romance. Industry cares about resources, about efficiency, about profit, about supply, about demand. In the early era, orbit, the Moon, and Mars were expensive and carefully managed. They were the main projects, the flagship settlements, the famous ones, the ones that got documentaries and speeches and political arguments. But behind those famous settlements, there was a growing need. A need for raw materials, a need for metals, a need for water, a need for fuel, a need for carbon, a need for rare elements, a need for everything that a growing interplanetary economy requires. And Earth, for all its abundance, was still a gravity well. Earth's gravity is expensive. Every kilogram launched cost energy and time and money. The Moon helped because its gravity was low. Mars helped because it could produce some resources locally. But if humanity wanted to expand and build and manufacture and trade on a larger scale, it needed a new source. And that source was the asteroid belt. The asteroid belt is not a single place, not a neat ring, not a tidy zone. It is a wide region, filled with countless objects, rocks, metallic bodies, ice-rich fragments, carbon-rich stones. Some are tiny, some are enormous, some are stable, some are tumbling, some are smooth, some are jagged. Most are unremarkable, but together they represent an incredible wealth. Not wealth in the form of gold, not wealth in the form of jewelry, but wealth in the form of industrial potential, because asteroids contain iron, nickel, cobalt, platinum group metals, silicates, water ice, carbon compounds, and many other materials that humans always find useful. And so, the age of asteroid mining began. Not with a bang, not with a dramatic invasion, but with robot probes and corporate contracts and careful planning. At first, asteroid mining was mostly robotic. Machines were sent to attach to asteroids, to drill, to cut, to collect, to process. The robots were monitored from Earth, or from lunar stations, or from Martian bases. But the distance was inconvenient. Signals took time. Repairs were difficult. And so, as always, humans moved closer. They built small habitats near the work. The first built habitats were tiny. They were not cities. They were not even towns. They were more like remote mining camps in a cold desert. Except the desert was space, and the cold was absolute, and the danger was constant. A built habitat might house only 12 people, or 30, or 50. It might have a rotating ring to provide a small amount of gravity, or it might have no gravity at all. It might have a small greenhouse, or it might rely entirely on shipped food. It might have a basic medical bay, or it might rely on telemedicine and emergency evacuation plans. It might have a single docking port and a single small ship for emergencies. The built habitats were built for function, not comfort. They were industrial. They were boring. They were full of noise from machines, but quiet in the sense that there was no wind, no birds, no rain, only the hum of life support, the click of tools, the soft voices of tired workers. The people who lived in the belt were not treated like heroes. They were treated like employees, because that is what they were. They were miners, mechanics, engineers, logistics managers, safety inspectors, machine operators. They worked in shifts. They followed schedules. They lived by routine. A belt worker might wake up, eat a simple meal, check the day's tasks, put on a suit, exit through an airlock, and spend hours outside, working on a machine, repairing a drill, checking a tether, installing a sensor. Then they would return, clean dust and debris, remove the suit, log their work, eat again, exercise, sleep, and then do it again, day after day, week after week, month after month, sometimes for years. And because these lives were repetitive, they did not become famous. No one on earth wanted to watch a documentary about a miner tightening bolts on a wreck in the dark. History did not pay attention, and that is important, because attention is the first form of memory. When you stop paying attention, you begin forgetting. As the belt industry expanded, more habitats were built. Some were anchored to asteroids. Some were free-floating. Some were attached to processing plants. Some were attached to refineries. Some were attached to fuel depots. Some were attached to shipyards. Some were built only as sleeping quarters for rotating crews. Many habitats were not designed for permanent families. They were designed for rotating contracts. People would arrive, work for a year or two, and then leave, replaced by others. This created a particular kind of culture, a culture of temporary life, a culture of we are here for now, a culture of we will move on. And when a place is temporary, it is easier to abandon, because no one feels deeply rooted. Meanwhile, in orbit, and on the moon, and on Mars, the large colonies continued. They grew. Slowly, they became more comfortable. They built more parks, more schools, more cultural centers. They developed art, music, sports. They created festivals. They created traditions. They created identities. But the belt remained industrial, practical, and quiet. And so, the belt became the first region filled with colonies that mattered economically, but did not matter culturally. This is how forgetting begins. When something is useful, but not loved, it becomes invisible. Then, another expansion began. The outer solar system, with Jupiter, Saturn, and their moons. These places were far, cold, and difficult, but they held something important. Water, ice, and more importantly, fuel potential. Because water can be split into hydrogen and oxygen. And hydrogen and oxygen are useful for rockets, for energy, for life support, for industry. And so, humanity began building small outposts near icy moons, not large colonies, not city domes, but research stations, fuel depots, relay stations, and processing plants. Some outposts were built near Europa, some near Ganymede, some near Callisto, some near Titan, some near Enceladus, some near smaller moons that most people on Earth had never heard of. These outposts were built for specific purposes: to extract ice, to process it, to store it, to refuel ships, to support long-range travel. They were the boring backbone of a growing space network. Without them, long-range travel would be too expensive, too slow, too risky. But because they were boring, they were not celebrated. And so, the solar system began to fill with a quiet infrastructure, a web of small places, each one necessary, each one functional, each one easily overlooked. As the number of colonies increased, the administrative burden increased. There were registries, tracking habitats, tracking crew rotations, tracking supplies, tracking fuel depots, tracking ship schedules, tracking legal ownership, tracking safety compliance. And at first, this system worked because there were still only a few hundred major sites, and Earth still had the capacity to care. But as decades passed, the number of small worlds became too large. Thousands, then tens of thousands. If you counted every minor outpost, every temporary work habitat, every relay station, every automated factory, the solar system became crowded, not crowded like a city, but crowded like a network of points, each one a small dot on a map. And maps became complex, and complexity creates gaps, because when something becomes too complex, people simplify. They focus on the main nodes. They focus on the major hubs. They focus on the famous settlements. And they ignore the small ones. And so, the first stage of forgetting was simply administrative neglect, not cruelty, not malice, just overload. A clerk on Earth cannot care about every habitat. A government agency cannot monitor every mining station. A corporation cannot maintain every outpost forever, especially when some outposts stop being profitable or stop being useful. And so, the small worlds began to fade from official attention, even while they still existed, even while people still lived there. Now, we will pause and focus on one important idea, the idea of colony lifespan. In the early era, a colony was built to last. It was expensive. It was difficult. It was precious. So it was designed for permanence. But in the age of small worlds, colonies became cheaper because automation improved, because 3D printing improved, because modular construction improved, because ships became better, because energy systems improved. A small habitat could be printed, assembled, and pressurized in months, not decades. A mining station could be built quickly, used for 5 years, and then abandoned. A fuel depot could be set up, used for a decade, and then replaced. A research outpost could be built, used for a few years, and then dismantled. And so, colonies became temporary infrastructure. They were not homes. They were projects, and projects, and when projects end, people leave. And when people leave, places become empty. And empty places are easy to forget. At first, abandoned colonies were rare, because the network was small, and because everyone still paid attention. But as the network expanded, abandonment became common. Not dramatic abandonment, not emergency evacuation. Often, planned abandonment. A mine runs dry. The contract ends. The crew leaves. The habitat is sealed. The systems are shut down. And the station is left in darkness, like an empty warehouse, in deep space. Sometimes, the station is dismantled. Sometimes, valuable parts are removed. Sometimes, it is left intact, because dismantling is expensive. Sometimes, it is left as a potential future site for reuse. And then, over time, people forget it exists. Now, we come to the first truly strange moment in the history of forgotten colonies. The first time a colony was not merely abandoned, but lost. Lost, not destroyed, not exploded, not attacked, but lost because it vanished from the network. It happened in the belt because the belt was full of small habitats, and because communication was already a little fragile. The habitat was not famous. It was not large. It was a medium station, attached to a processing facility. It housed about 40 people, miners, engineers, and maintenance crew. Its name was long and corporate, like many stations, something like Belt Resource Node 47B, or Series Outer Processing Station. The exact name was not important, Because that is part of the point. The colony's name was not memorable. It was a label, not a story. And 1 month, its report did not arrive. The monthly status report did not appear. At first, no one panicked, because reports are delayed. Signals fail. Data packets get corrupted. A transmitter breaks. A software update causes errors. These things happen, especially in the belt. So the administrators sent a message and waited. No reply. They sent another message and waited. No reply. They checked the relay stations. They checked the network logs. They checked the last recorded telemetry. Everything looked normal. The habitat was still transmitting basic automated pings, but not human reports. That was strange, but still not alarming. Because maybe the crew was busy. Maybe the comm officer was sick. Maybe there was a CIAM failure. Maybe there was a minor accident. So they waited. A week passed. Then 2. Then 3. Then the automated pings also stopped. Now, it became serious. A rescue ship was scheduled. But rescue ships are slow because space is slow. Even with improved engines, a ship must wait for transfer windows, must conserve fuel, must plan trajectories. So the rescue ship arrived months later. And when it arrived, it found the habitat intact. No explosion, no debris, no damage. The docking port was sealed. The exterior showed no breach. The station was dark. The rescue crew approached carefully. They connected power. They entered through emergency procedures. And inside, they found silence. The corridors were empty. The sleeping pods were empty. The cafeteria was empty. The medical bay was empty. The logs showed that the station had functioned until a certain date. Then there was a gap. Then the systems were shut down in an orderly manner. Not a catastrophic failure. Not a sudden emergency. An orderly shutdown. The crew had left. They had taken a ship that should have been registered, tracked, monitored. But the ship was not in the logs. It had departed without proper clearance, without proper reporting. It had simply gone, and no one knew where. No distress call, no emergency beacon, no recorded conflict, just departure. This event did not become a massive news story. Not at first, because Earth was busy, because the belt was far, because only 40 people were involved, because the colony's name was not memorable, because the story was not dramatic enough for most media. But within the interplanetary network, it caused a quiet fear, because it introduced a new possibility. The possibility that a colony could disappear without noise, without violence, without a trace. And once that possibility exists, it becomes a shadow over every other small world. In the following years, it happened again. Not often, but enough. Enough to create a pattern. A small station fails to report. A rescue ship arrives. The station is empty. Or the station is abandoned without proper documentation. Or the station's crew is gone with no clear destination. Sometimes the station contains bodies. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes there are signs of slow failure. Oxygen filters clogged. Food stores depleted. Medical supplies empty. Sometimes there are signs of conflict. A broken door. A damaged comm panel. A smashed terminal. But most of the time, the story is quiet and incomplete because space erases evidence. Time erases evidence. And the farther away a colony is, the less likely anyone will ever know exactly what happened. Now, let us drift into the reasons colonies became forgotten. Because the reasons were boring and human. They were not cosmic mysteries. They were not alien attacks. They were not supernatural events. They were economics, politics, fatigue, and distance. One reason was corporate collapse. Many small colonies were owned by corporations, mining companies, fuel consortiums, manufacturing partnerships, and corporations can fail. A market crash, a bad investment, a legal dispute, a supply chain disruption, a competitor, a new technology that makes an old process obsolete. When a corporation fails, it stops paying for maintenance, for shipments, for replacement parts, for crew rotations. The colony is suddenly on its own. Sometimes the crew is evacuated. Sometimes the crew is abandoned. Sometimes the crew chooses to stay and make the colony independent. Sometimes the colony slowly dies. Sometimes it becomes a ghost. Another reason was political distraction. Earth governments did not always agree. Some wanted expansion. Some wanted consolidation. Some wanted to focus inward. Some wanted to cut budgets. Some wanted to invest in social programs, or defense, or climate recovery, or AI infrastructure. Space was expensive, and space colonies were far away. It is easy for politicians to cut funding for things that their voters cannot see. And so, some colonies lost support, not because they failed, but because Earth's attention moved elsewhere. Another reason was technological change. A new engine might make an old refueling depot unnecessary. A new mining technique might make an old asteroid site obsolete. A new manufacturing process might make an orbital factory irrelevant. A new communication system might make an old relay station outdated. And when a colony becomes obsolete, it is abandoned, sometimes gently, sometimes abruptly, and over time, the abandoned sites pile up like old tools left in a shed. Well, another reason was migration. Colonists sometimes moved, not because they were forced, but because they wanted a better life. A belt station might be uncomfortable. A lunar settlement might offer better schools. A Martian city might offer better culture. A new orbital habitat might offer more space, more parks, more comfort. And so, people moved, just as people move on Earth, from small towns to cities, from old neighborhoods to new ones. Migration creates emptiness. Old places decline. New places grow. And when a place declines, it becomes easier to forget. Now, the age of small worlds also produced a new kind of colony, the automated colony. A fully automated station might have no permanent residence. It might be visited once a year or once every few years. It might run mining machines, processing plants, fuel extraction systems, with only robots and AI monitoring. These automated colonies were efficient, cheap, and abundant, but they were also invisible, because if no one lives there, no one tells stories about it, no one writes songs about it, no one makes art about it, no one remembers it. It is simply a dot on a map, a line in a database. And databases are not eternal. Databases get corrupted. Databases get reorganized. Databases get deleted. Databases get lost. And so, automated colonies were among the first to become truly forgotten, because when the database entry disappears, the colony might still be there, silent, running, or shut down, but no one remembers where it is or why it exists. Now, we must talk about the expansion of shipyards, because shipyards were a major part of this era. As the belt produced metals, and the moon produced fuel, and orbit produced manufactured parts, shipbuilding became easier. Ships were built, not on Earth, but in orbit, or near the moon, or near the belt. Large dry docks assembled interplanetary vessels, cargo ships, passenger transports, exploration ships, military patrol craft, and deep space research vessels. Shipyards became hubs, busy, industrial, and important. And around shipyards, small colonies formed, worker habitats, administrative stations, repair depots, fuel storage rings. These colonies were not famous. They were not glamorous. They were like industrial ports in space. And like industrial ports, they could decline when trade routes changed, when a shipyard moved, when a company collapsed, when a new dock was built. The old port became obsolete. And so, shipyard colonies also became abandoned and forgotten. Now, we will drift into one of the quietest truths of the age of small worlds. The solar system became full of empty places, empty places, that once held life, but because they were empty, no one cared. This is a strange thing. Humans are emotional. Humans care about people, but not always about places. When people leave a place, the place becomes just an object, just a structure, just an old station, just an abandoned dome, just a dead habitat. And so, the solar system became a museum of abandoned infrastructure. But the museum had no visitors because it was too large, too scattered, too distant. And so, it became a forgotten museum. As the centuries passed, some abandoned colonies were rediscovered and reused. A new company might move into an old habitat, repair it, pressurize it again, and use it. A new research team might occupy an old outpost for a short time. A salvage crew might strip an abandoned station for parts, but many abandoned colonies were never revisited because there were too many, and because building new ones was often easier than repairing old ones. And so, abandoned colonies remained silent in the dark. Now, let us pause and imagine what it looks like to approach an abandoned station, because this image is one of the most important in the entire story. A ship drifts through space. Slowly, its engines fire gently. Its navigation systems calculate approach. The abandoned station is a small shape against the stars. Perhaps it is spinning slowly. Perhaps it is not spinning at all. Perhaps its solar panels are folded. Perhaps they are extended. Perhaps a few lights still blink. Perhaps everything is dark. The ship approaches carefully because debris can be dangerous. The crew looks through windows and sees nothing moving. No docking lights, no radio chatter, no signals, just silence. When they dock, they hear only the soft thump of connection. They run diagnostics. They check for pressure. They open an airlock and step inside. And inside, there is dust floating. There are old tools left on shelves. There are old containers. There are old personal items. A cup, a notebook, a photograph, a child's toy. Sometimes there are plants, dead, brown, curled. Sometimes there are frozen plants, preserved in the cold. Sometimes there are old screens, still showing the last status report. Sometimes there are recorded voices, still stored in data logs. Sometimes there is a smell, a stale smell of old plastic and old air. And the crew moves quietly because abandoned places feel sacred, not because they are holy, but because they once held life. And life leaves an imprint, even in metal corridors. Now, in the age of small worlds, these abandoned places became common. Salvage crews became a profession. Their job was to visit abandoned habitats, remove valuable equipment, remove metals, remove fuel tanks, remove electronics, and bring them to active colonies. Salvage crews were not romantic. They were practical. They were like junkyard workers. In space, they worked slowly. They documented hazards. They checked for radiation. They checked for mold. They checked for chemical leaks. They checked for structural damage. They removed parts. They sealed doors. They left. And often, they did not even record the story of the place. They recorded inventory. They recorded value. They recorded mass and weight. They recorded profit. And so, even when an abandoned colony was visited, its history was not preserved because preservation was not profitable, and profit was what drove much of the aid. Now, we move toward the end of Part 2, where the number of forgotten colonies becomes so large that they form a new category, not just abandoned, but lost. Because when you have enough abandoned places, some become untraceable. Some lose their coordinates. Some lose their records. Some are misfiled. Some are mislabeled. Some drift because their station-keeping fails. Some collide with debris. Some break apart slowly. Some fall into planetary gravity wells and crash. Some become unrecognizable. And so, the solar system began to fill with unknown objects. Some were natural asteroids. Some were human stations. Some were old cargo containers. Some were broken satellites. Some were debris. And in that clutter, history became blurred. Earth still existed, still functioned, still traded, still influenced the colonies. But Earth was tired. Earth's politics had changed many times. Earth's culture had changed many times. Earth's attention shifted again and again. Sometimes Earth focused on space. Sometimes it ignored it. Sometimes space was seen as the future. Sometimes it was seen as a burden. And this inconsistency also contributed to forgetting, because when a project is not consistent, records become messy, budgets become unstable, infrastructure becomes neglected, and neglect is the soil where forgetting grows. Now, let us end Part 2 with one final image, one final slow thought. The solar system, in the age of small worlds, was like an ocean filled with islands. Some islands were large and famous: orbit cities, moon settlements, Mars domes. Some islands were small and functional: mining rings, fuel depots, relay stations. Some islands were empty: abandoned habitats, silent domes, dark corridors. And the ocean was vast and dark and quiet. And in that ocean, some islands were remembered and some were forgotten. And that is where Part 2 ends. Because in Part 3, the story becomes even quieter, and even more divided. Because part 3 is when the colonies stop listening, when communication fractures, when the web of connection tears, and the forgotten colonies become not just abandoned, but truly lost. So now, let your breathing slow. Let your mind drift. If you are sleepy, that is perfect. If you are awake, that is also fine. Because the story continues. Whenever you are ready. Hello again. Welcome back. If you are still listening, you are doing perfectly. There is no rush. There is no goal. You don't need to stay awake. You don't need to focus hard. You can simply let the words pass through your mind, like a soft wind, moving through tall grass. In part 2, we drifted through the age of small worlds. We saw the asteroid belt, filled with mining habitats. We saw shipyards, and fuel depots, and relay stations spread outward. We saw colonies become temporary, industrial, and easily abandoned. And we saw the first truly strange thing. A colony that did not explode, did not send a distress call, did not leave debris, but simply vanished, quietly, like a light turning off. In part 3, the quiet spreads. The solar system becomes bigger, but also more disconnected. Because distance is not only physical, distance is also psychological. Distance is attention. Distance is memory. And the farther apart humans lived, the less they shared, the less they cared, and the less they remembered. Now, take a slow breath. Let your shoulders sink. Let your eyes rest. And we will begin. At first, the interplanetary network was held together by communication. Communication was the glue. Communication was the thread. Communication was the heartbeat. Earth spoke to the moon. The moon spoke to Mars. Mars spoke to the belt. The belt spoke to Jupiter's outposts. Ships carried data. Relay stations boosted signals. Orbit cities hosted servers. Archives were stored, copied, mirrored, and protected. For a long time, this worked. It was not perfect, but it worked. But as the centuries passed, the network became too large and too fragile. And that fragility was not caused by one disaster. It was caused by slow strain. The first strain was technical. Communication systems need maintenance. Satellites degrade. Radiation damages electronics. Micrometeoroids puncture panels. Solar storms overload circuits. Software becomes outdated. Security protocols change. Encryption standards evolve. And when a network is small, maintenance is manageable. But when a network spans millions of kilometers and contains tens of thousands of nodes, maintenance becomes impossible to perfect. Some relay stations were upgraded. Some were not. Some were repaired. Some were abandoned. Some were replaced. Some were forgotten. And when relay stations fail, communication becomes patchy. Signals become weak. Messages become delayed. Data becomes corrupted. And slowly, Without drama, the solar system began to lose its smooth connection. The second strain was political. Earth governments changed and changed again. And as they changed, their priorities shifted. Sometimes Earth was generous. Sometimes it was strict. Sometimes Earth saw the colonies as children, sometimes as partners, sometimes as burdens, sometimes as threats. Sometimes Earth funded infrastructure upgrades. Sometimes Earth cut budgets. Sometimes Earth tried to centralize control. Sometimes Earth tried to withdraw. And the colonies also changed. Mars developed its own identity. The Moon developed its own culture. The Belt developed its own working class. The outer system outposts developed their own rules. And as these identities grew, the desire to stay connected weakened, not because people hated each other, but because they no longer needed each other. In the same way, the third strain was economic. Trade routes shifted. New technologies emerged. Local manufacturing improved. Colonies became more self-sufficient. In the early era, everything came from Earth. Food, medicine, spare parts, computers, cultural products, music, films, books. But later, colonies produced their own. They printed parts. They grew food. They manufactured electronics. They wrote their own entertainment. They built their own ships. They developed their own industries. And as they became self-sufficient, their dependence on Earth decreased. And when dependence decreases, attention decreases. Because dependence is a reason to care. So the network slowly began to loosen. Earth still existed. Earth still mattered. But Earth no longer felt like the center. Not emotionally, not culturally, not economically. The solar system was becoming a set of regions instead of one civilization. And regions do not always talk as much as empires do. Now, this did not happen all at once. It happened through small changes, like the slow shifting of tectonic plates. You do not notice it day to day, but over time, the map changes. One of the first major signs was the decline of centralized archives. In the early era, Earth maintained massive record systems. Every colony, every habitat, every ship, every fuel depot, every relay station had an entry, coordinates, ownership, crew lists, maintenance schedules, supply chains. But over centuries, the archives became too large and too expensive to maintain perfectly. Records were duplicated and stored in multiple places. But duplicates create disagreements. One archive might say, a station is active. Another might say, it is abandoned. One might list coordinates. Another might list outdated coordinates. One might list a new name. Another might list the old one. And when records disagree, people stop trusting them. And when people stop trusting records, they stop using them. And when records are not used, they decay. Now, we must pause and appreciate how fragile digital memory is. Many people imagine that digital memory lasts forever, but it does not. Digital memory requires power. Digital memory requires maintenance. Digital memory requires compatibility. A file format from one century might not be readable in another. A storage medium might degrade. A server farm might be shut down. A data center might be destroyed. A backup system might fail. And the larger and more complex the archive, the more likely some portion will be lost, not dramatically, but quietly. This is one of the saddest and most boring truths of all history, not only space history, but all history. Most loss is not violent. Most loss is not dramatic. Most loss is administrative. A folder not copied, a server not maintained, a database migration done poorly, a budget cut, a technician who retires, a company that collapses, a government that reorganizes, a storage system that is replaced. And then, one day, you realize something is missing, and you cannot even say when it vanished, because it did not vanish. In a moment, it dissolved over time. Now, as communication weakened and archives degraded, a new phenomenon appeared: the rise of local networks. Instead of one solar system internet, there were many. Mars built its own. The Moon built its own. The belt hubs built theirs. Jupiter's region built theirs. Saturn's region built theirs. Each network was internally stable, but not always connected to the others. Sometimes the network synchronized through data ships, physical vessels carrying storage drives. Sometimes they synchronized through relay bursts. Sometimes they did not synchronize for years. Sometimes they never synchronized again. And this created a very strange reality. Two colonies might both exist, but each one believed different history. Each one had different records, different maps, different lists, different knowledge of which habitats were active, which were abandoned, which were lost. And so, the solar system began to split, not only physically, but informationally. And informational distance is one of the strongest forces in forgetting. Now, we will drift into the period known later as the Great Quiet, not because everything was silent. There was still industry, still trade, still people, still movement. But the Great Quiet was a quiet in the sense that the solar system stopped telling one story. There was no longer one narrative. There were many narratives, and they did not align. During the Great Quiet, Mars grew into a true planet society. It expanded beyond its original domes. It built underground cities. It built canyon settlements. It built greenhouse valleys. It built orbital rings. Mars became a world with its own generations. People born and raised and dying without ever seeing Earth. Earth was no longer a home. Earth was a myth, a historical origin, a place of stories. Mars education still taught Earth history, but with a different tone. Earth was not us. Earth was where we came from. And this subtle shift was enormous, because when a place becomes where we came from, it becomes less emotionally present. And when emotion fades, memory fades. The moon became a cultural bridge. The moon was closer to Earth. It was still connected, more than others. But even the moon developed its own identity. Lunar settlements became stable, comfortable. They became the headquarters for shipyards, for trade hubs, for finance systems. The moon became a place of administration and logistics, and with that, it became practical and a little cold. The moon was like a giant port city, always busy, always working, always calculating. And port cities do not always care about the distant villages that supply them. They care about trade and schedules and fuel. And so, the moon's attention toward small colonies also weakened. The belt became a rough frontier, but not a romantic one. It became a network of labor hubs, union settlements, corporate stations, independent habitats, and abandoned shells. The belt's culture was practical, tough, and somewhat suspicious. The belt did not trust Earth. The belt did not trust Mars. The belt trusted its own hubs, its own crews, its own contracts. And as the belt grew, it became a civilization of fragments, not one unified society. Many small habitats had their own rules, their own traditions, their own slang, their own schedules. And because the belt was so scattered, it became the easiest region for colonies to disappear. Now, we must speak about one of the most important causes of forgotten colonies: communication collapse. Because when communication collapses, even a living colony can become forgotten. A colony can still exist, with people living and working and raising children. But if it loses communication, it becomes invisible. It becomes a silent island in the ocean of space. And in the great quiet, communication collapse became common. Sometimes it happened because of relay failures. A relay station might be hit by debris. A solar storm might destroy its electronics. A micrometeoroid might puncture a radiator. A maintenance crew might never arrive, and the station would fail. And without that relay, dozens of colonies might lose contact. Suddenly, a whole region might go silent, and sometimes no one noticed, because no one was watching, because no one cared, because the region was small and economically unimportant, or because the archives were already outdated. So the silence did not stand out. Sometimes communication collapse happened because of politics. A colony might choose to disconnect, to avoid taxes, to avoid regulation, to avoid corporate oversight, to avoid Earth's laws. It might become an independent settlement, a hidden settlement, a place of secrecy. Some colonies wanted freedom, some wanted privacy, some wanted to escape, some wanted to do illegal work, some wanted to live quietly, without interference, and space, with its vast distances, allowed that. If you turn off your beacon, if you hide your transmissions, if you move slightly, if you blend into asteroid clutter, you can disappear. Not perfectly, but enough. And so, some colonies were not forgotten by accident. They were forgotten by choice. Sometimes communication collapse happened because of culture. A colony might simply stop reporting because it no longer felt connected. It no longer saw value in sending reports to Earth agencies that never responded. It no longer saw value in paying fees to a distant administration. It no longer saw value in being part of a system that did not care. And so, it stopped. It became a self-contained world. And to everyone else, it became a blank space. Now, the Great Quiet was also the era when ships became more autonomous. Ships could travel with fewer crew. Ships could navigate and repair themselves. Ships could carry cargo without humans. This increased efficiency, but also decreased human connection, because in earlier eras, ships carried people. People carried news. People carried stories. People carried culture. But in the Great Quiet, cargo ships were often robotic. They did not gossip. They did not write letters. They did not tell stories. They simply delivered goods. And so, even trade became less cultural. Trade became numbers, not narratives. Now, we will drift into the most haunting part of Part 3, the era when whole colony chains went silent. Imagine a region of the belt with 30 habitats, mines, processing plants, fuel depots, all connected through one relay cluster. If that relay cluster fails, all 30 habitats lose contact. They can still communicate with each other locally, but not with the wider system. They can still survive. For years, they can still trade locally. They can still maintain their own little economy. But to the rest, they become silent. And in the archives, their status might remain active for decades because no one updates it. Or their status might become unknown and then, eventually, deleted because unknown things are uncomfortable and administrators prefer clean lists. And so, whole clusters were removed from official maps, not because they were destroyed, but because they were inconvenient to track. Now, Let us consider what it means to live in a silent colony cluster. The people there still have lives. They still have birthdays. They still have funerals. They still have arguments. They still have love. They still have boredom. They still have routines. They still repair machines. They still cook meals. They still watch entertainment. They still teach children. They still tell stories. But their stories become local. They no longer hear new music from Earth. They no longer see new films from Mars. They no longer receive news updates. They become a closed culture, a culture that evolves in isolation and over generations. Their language shifts. Their slang changes. Their traditions mutate. Their memory of Earth becomes mythic. Their memory of Mars becomes vague. Their memory of the wider system becomes like ancient history. And this is how a forgotten colony becomes a lost world, not destroyed, not dead, just separate. With some silent colonies eventually reconnected. A passing ship might discover them. A new relay station might be built nearby. A trade route might shift and bring contact again. And when reconnection happened, it was strange because the colony might have changed. Its records might not match. Its laws might be different. Its identity might be independent. Sometimes recon action was peaceful. Sometimes it caused conflict. Sometimes it caused quiet misunderstanding. Because when people live apart for centuries, they do not easily become one again. But many silent colonies never reconnected. They remained isolated until they failed, or until they drifted, or until their resources ran out, or until their habitat broke, or until their population declined, or until they simply continued unknown for centuries. Now, we come to another important cause of forgotten colonies: resource exhaustion. Many small colonies were built for one purpose: to mine one asteroid, to extract one deposit, to refine one material. When that resource ran out, the colony had no reason to exist. And if it had lost contact or had become independent, it might not have the infrastructure to relocate, so it would decline. Slowly, a colony might go from 500 people to 200, to 50, to 12, to 3, and finally, to none. Not with drama, but with quiet departure. One family leaves, then another, and the last few people either leave or die, and the station becomes empty and silent. Now, in the Great Quiet, this kind of decline became common, and because it was common, no one recorded it. Because common things are rarely documented, history tends to record the unusual, the dramatic, the political, but the slow decline of a small mining habitat does not become a famous story. And so, these declines became unwritten An unwritten history is the easiest history to lose. Now, we will drift into the deep outer system, because the outer system was one of the most fragile regions. Jupiter and Saturn had outposts, but they were far, and communication delays were long. Ships traveled less frequently. The population was smaller. The infrastructure was weaker. Outposts depended on occasional shipments and maintenance. And when the Great Quiet began, the outer system was among the first to suffer, because it was already on the edge. Some outer system outposts were evacuated, planned evacuations, because they were no longer worth the cost. Some were abandoned, with equipment left behind. Some were left with automated systems. Some were left with small crews who chose to stay. And over time, many outer outposts became ghost stations, silent domes, dark fuel depots, empty research labs. And because they were far, they were rarely visited. So they became some of the earliest true lost colonies. Now, we must speak about the role of war. Because yes, even in this sleepy history, war exists. But war was not the main cause. War was a background hum, a series of tensions, a few conflicts, trade disputes, political disagreements, resource conflicts. But there was no giant solar system war. Not in this era. Instead, there were small, localized conflicts. And those conflicts had a particular effect. They made colonies hide. When people fear conflict, they reduce transmissions. They stop advertising their location. They avoid attention. And so, even the possibility of war increased forgetting, because secrecy creates invisibility. Now, as the Great Quiet continued, the number of forgotten colonies became enormous. There were forgotten stations in orbit, forgotten mines in the belt, forgotten fuel depots near Jupiter, forgotten relay nodes between planets, forgotten shipyards in distant orbits, forgotten habitats tumbling slowly in the dark. In the archives, on Earth, on the Moon, on Mars, were no longer complete. They were partial, contradictory, and decayed. At some point, a new generation looked at the maps and realized they could not trust them. They could not say how many colonies existed. They could not say how many were active. They could not say how many were abandoned. They could not say how many were lost. The solar system had become too large for one mind, too large for one administration, too large for one civilization to remember. And that was the moment when the forgotten colonies stopped being a rare curiosity and became a defining feature of human space history. Because when you cannot remember where your people are, you are no longer a unified species. You are a scattered set of worlds, some connected, some isolated, some dead, some alive, some forgotten. Now, let us end part 3 with one quiet, sleepy, and slightly haunting image. Imagine a data archive somewhere on Earth or on the Moon, a massive server vault built centuries ago to store all colony records. It is underground, cold, shielded. It is filled with racks and racks and racks of storage units. And for a long time, it was maintained. Technicians checked it. Power systems were replaced. Cooling systems were upgraded. But then, budget cuts happened. Politics shifted, and maintenance became rare. Then, one day, a cooling system failed. Not catastrophically, just enough to cause slow damage. A section of the archive overheated, data degraded, files corrupted, indexes broke, and no one noticed. For years, because no one was checking, and when someone finally noticed, they tried to recover the data. But the backups were incomplete. The mirrors were outdated. The formats were incompatible. And so, quietly, without drama, without explosion, without tragedy, the solar system lost a piece of its own memory, a list of colonies, coordinates, names, histories, simply gone. And when memory is gone, the colonies become truly lost. If you have made it this far, even if the habitats you are doing wonderfully still float, and if you are half asleep in the dark, that is even better, still intact. Because part 4, still waiting, is not about action. Like silent museums, it is not about battle of human life. It is not about speed, and that it is not about part loud discovery. Because it part is about 4 is the final return. Slow rediscovery is the return, and the soft, the rediscovery, almost sad, the age of remembering, and in the part slow, 1, quiet, we watched humanity leave haunting Earth. Moment. In part 2, when humans begin, we watch small to worlds multiply, the lost worlds. In part 3, again, we watched communication fracture. Now, you can rest, silence spread, you can drift, and now, you can sleep. In part 4, and whenever we reach the moment, ready, when the future finally looks back and asks, what did we lose? Now, take a slow breath. Let your jaw relax. Let your eyes soften. And we will begin. By this time, centuries had passed. Not a few decades. Not one human lifetime. But many generations. Born, raised, and buried. In orbit. On the Moon. On Mars. In the Belt. And in distant outposts. Earth was still alive. But Earth was no longer the unquestioned center. Earth had become one world among many. Still important. Still influential. But no longer the storyteller. And that mattered. Because the storyteller controls memory. And when the storyteller changes, memory changes. In the Great Quiet, many colonies were forgotten. But something else happened too. A slow cultural shift. A new kind of person appeared. A new kind of profession. Not miners. Not engineers. Not soldiers. Not politicians. But archivists. These archivists were not like the old librarians of Earth. They were space archivists. map restorers, data archaeologists. They were people who lived in an era when the solar system had too many blank spaces and too many contradictions. They lived in a time when you could not answer a simple question, how many colonies exist? Because the answer was no longer known, and that uncertainty became uncomfortable. Because humans do not like unknown lists. Humans do not like unfinished maps. The first archivists did not begin as a grand movement. They began as a practical necessity. Trade needed maps. Navigation needed coordinates. Shipping needed reliable relay nodes. And so, a few organizations began rebuilding archives. Mars built a new registry. The Moon built a trade database. Belt hubs built union records. Earth built a renewed administrative system. But the problem was, these archives did not agree. They were still fragmented. And so, the archivists began to compare, to reconcile, to search, to verify, and in doing so, they began to discover the lost worlds. At first, the rediscovery was boring. It was checking coordinates and finding an old fuel depot still intact. It was approaching an abandoned station and confirming it was empty. It was sending a drone to inspect a silent relay node and then marking it non-functional. It was updating a database with a line that said, Station 119B, abandoned. It was administrative work, the kind of work that never becomes famous, the kind of work that history rarely celebrates. But this boring work slowly changed everything, because as they verified, they also found surprises. The first surprise was how much still existed. People had assumed that abandoned colonies would decay quickly, that they would break apart, that they would be destroyed by micrometeoroids or radiation or time. But many stations were built with redundancy, with strong materials, with shielding. They were built to survive accidents. And in space, where there is no weather, where there is no rain, no wind, no rust, no plant roots, no animals, structures can last a very long time. A station, sealed and left, can remain almost unchanged for centuries, like a time capsule. So the archivists began finding habitats that were perfectly preserved. Inside, they found cups still on tables, tools still in drawers, boots still in lockers, old posters on walls, old screens frozen. On the last report, they found children's drawings in a school module. They found a greenhouse where the plants had died, but the leaves still floated as brittle paper in zero gravity. They found sleeping pods with blankets still strapped in place. They found a kitchen with containers still labeled with meal codes. They found medical records stored in local drives. They found music files. They found personal journals. And in those journals, they found voices, human voices, from centuries earlier, still speaking, still describing their daily lives, their boredom, their loneliness, their routines, their hopes, their complaints. And suddenly, the abandoned stations stopped being industrial debris and became something else. They became lost worlds. Now, the archivists were not dramatic people. They were careful, quiet, and methodical. They treated each station like a fragile artifact, because it was. A habitat is not just metal. It is human life, frozen in time. And so, they developed protocols. They approached slowly. They scanned for hazards. They checked for pressure. They checked for radiation. They checked for chemical leaks. They sealed off contaminated areas. They documented everything. They photographed. They recorded. They copied data. They did not take souvenirs, because they understood that souvenirs destroy context, and context is the most valuable thing in archaeology. Now, as rediscovery increased, the archivists created a new category, the catalog of echoes. This was not an official name. At first, it was slang. Among archivists, they would say, "This is another echo." An echo was a colony that still existed physically, but no longer existed in the living network. It was a place that still had walls, still had corridors, still had signs, but no longer had people. And each echo told a story, not through grand events, but through small details. One echo might show a belt mining crew struggling with supply shortages. Their logs show increasing delays. Their messages show frustration, then resignation, then silence. Another echo might show a family habitat, a small independent colony, where children were born, where birthdays were celebrated, where someone wrote a poem about missing Earth's rain. And then the colony ends, not with catastrophe, but with a note, leaving tomorrow habitat sealed. Another echo might show a research outpost near an icy moon, where scientists recorded beautiful data about subsurface oceans. And then funding was cut, and the outpost was abandoned. Another echo might show a shipyard habitat where workers built vessels for decades until trade shifted and the dock became obsolete. And then the last worker logs are full of boredom and jokes and tiredness. And then nothing. The archivists began to realize that the lost colonies were not all mysteries. Most were ordinary endings. They ended because the work ended, because the money ended, because the support ended, because the people moved, because the systems failed slowly. And this was both comforting and sad. Comforting, because it meant there was no hidden monster, no alien war, no cosmic horror. Sad, because it meant humans had simply forgotten each other. Now, as the catalog grew, something strange happened. The archivists began finding colonies that were not empty, colonies that were alive, but unknown. This was rare, but it happened. And when it happened, it was one of the most quietly shocking moments in human history. Imagine an archivist ship approaching a region of the belt where the records show a cluster of habitats abandoned centuries ago. The ship arrives, expecting ghosts, expecting silence, expecting empty corridors. But instead, it detects radio traffic, weak, old-fashioned, but real. It detects heat signatures. It detects power usage. It detects life support emissions. And then a signal arrives, a simple message in an old protocol, a message that says, "Identify yourself." The archivists reply. Carefully, they explain who they are. They explain they are from a major hub. They explain they believed this region was abandoned. And the reply comes back after a long delay. We have been here. Now, the first reconnections were delicate because these colonies had lived in isolation for centuries. They had their own culture, their own laws, their own language drift, their own myths. They did not trust outsiders. They did not know the current political landscape. They did not know the current trade systems. They did not know who controlled what. They did not know if the archivists were pirates, or corporate agents, or military scouts. And the archivists were not soldiers. They were not negotiators. They were researchers. So they approached. Slowly, they offered trade goods, medical supplies, information. They offered connection, and sometimes the isolated colony accepted. Sometimes it refused. Sometimes it negotiated. Sometimes it demanded to remain independent. Sometimes it asked for help, because isolation is hard. Even if it creates identity, it also creates fragility. A colony can survive for centuries, but one broken system, one epidemic, one reactor failure can end everything. And so, some isolated colonies were grateful to be found. Now, the rediscovery era did not produce a sudden reunification. The solar system did not become one again. Instead, it produced a new awareness that humanity was larger and stranger than anyone had assumed, that there were people living in hidden habitats, people who had never seen Earth or Mars or the Moon, people who thought the wider system might be a myth, people who believed they were the last humans, because in isolation, You do not know what else exists. And the archivists had to tell them, no, you are not alone. Now, let us talk about the greatest discovery of the archivist era. Not a living colony, not an abandoned station, but the lost fleet. The lost fleet was not a war fleet. It was not dramatic. It was a series of cargo ships and transports from the Great Quiet Era, ships that had departed from known hubs with known destinations, and then never arrived. In the old archives, these ships were listed as missing, but missing ships were common, and so they were not investigated deeply. But when archivists began cross-checking, they noticed patterns. Many missing ships vanished in the same regions, near the belt, near Jupiter transfer routes, near certain relay corridors. It was not enough to prove something, but it was enough to create curiosity. And curiosity is what archivists live on. So a long-range survey mission was launched, not a military mission, not a rescue mission, a survey mission, with scanners, drones, and patient time. They traveled slowly through old routes, following the faint traces of past navigation. And after months, they found something, a cluster of objects drifting together, not naturally, but in a pattern. Ships, old ships, covered in dust, their hull markings faded, their solar panels cracked, but still recognizable. Dozens of them. Then more. Then more. A whole graveyard of vessels drifting in a quiet region, hidden in the clutter of asteroid debris. Inside the ships, the archivists found nothing dramatic, no battle damage, no laser scars, no explosive breaches. Instead, they found system failures. One ship had a navigation error and drifted. Another ship followed its beacon and drifted too. Then another. Then another. A chain reaction of mistakes and automated safety protocols that led ships into a slow trap, a region where communication was weak and rescue unlikely. Ships drifted until their crews either evacuated to nearby habitats, or died, or entered stasis, or shut down systems to conserve. And over time, the ships became a silent fleet, a museum of lost journeys. The lost fleet became famous, not because it was exciting, but because it was symbolic. It showed how easy it was for humans to vanish in space without violence, without drama, just because of distance and neglect. And it became a turning point because it shocked the major hubs into funding, better mapping, better communication, better rescue infrastructure. Because suddenly, forgetting was no longer an abstract concept. It was a visible graveyard. Now, as the archivist era continued, The catalog of echoes grew larger, thousands of sites, then tens of thousands, each one documented, mapped, and classified. Some were stripped for salvage, some were preserved as historical monuments, some were sealed and left untouched, some were repurposed into new colonies. But the most interesting ones were the ones that still contained data, because data is where voices live. In one abandoned Mars satellite habitat, archivists found a cultural archive, a small server filled with music created by early Martian settlers, songs about dust storms, songs about missing blue skis, songs about greenhouse gardens, songs about the first child born on Mars. These songs were unknown to the modern era because they had never been uploaded to the main network. They had been stored locally and forgotten, and when archivists played them centuries later, they heard voices singing softly about hope, and it made them quiet because it reminded them that history is not only politics. History is also a person singing to stay sane. In a belt station, archivists found a library, not of books, but of personal diaries, written by miners, complaining about food rations, about cramped corridors, about endless repairs, about boredom, about missing sunlight. And the diaries were funny, in a tired way. They were full of jokes and sarcasm and frustration. And then, near the end, the diaries became more quiet, more tired, and then they stopped, and the archivists did not know if the writer left or died, but the voice was still there, on the drive, waiting. In an outer system research outpost, archivists found a scientific record of an icy moon's subsurface ocean, data that had been lost for centuries. It contained observations that modern scientists had never seen. It was like finding a missing chapter of science history, and it reminded everyone that forgetting is not only emotional. Forgetting also means losing knowledge, losing progress, losing the work of people who spent their lives collecting information. Now, as the archivist era matured, a new philosophy emerged, the philosophy of preservation, because people began to understand that expansion creates loss, that building new colonies without maintaining memory creates ghosts. And so, major hubs began building memory vaults, not only on Earth, but on Mars and the Moon, and in the belt. They created redundant archives, stored in physical form, etched on durable materials, not only digital drives. They created maps that were printed and stored. They created protocols to ensure that even if communication failed, a colony's existence would not vanish. And this is where the archivist era became hopeful, because it showed that humans could learn, Humans could adapt. Humans could decide to care, even after centuries of neglect, even after losing thousands of colonies. They could decide to remember. But Part 4 is not only hope. Part 4 also contains the deepest sadness, because as archivists mapped and rediscovered, they also confirmed the final truth. Many lost colonies were not alive. They were not hidden. They were dead. And not dead in a dramatic way. Dead in the quiet way, the most common way. Systems failed. Air ran out. Food ran out. Water recycling broke. Radiation exposure accumulated. Medical supplies ended. And the people did what humans always do. They tried to survive. They tried to repair. They tried to hold on. And then they did not. And their colonies became silent echoes. Archivists sometimes found the remains of people in sealed compartments. Sometimes they found a final message recorded by someone trying to be calm, trying to be brave. A message that said, "We did our best." A message that said, "We are sealing the habitat." A message that said, "If anyone finds this." A message that said, "Tell Earth." Sometimes the message was not dramatic. Sometimes it was boringly practical. Filter failure, no replacement. Reactor shutdown, unable to restart. Crop yield insufficient. Medical emergency, no evacuation. And those boring messages were the most haunting because they showed that death was not heroic. It was administrative failure and distance. Now, in the final stage of the archivist era, a great project begins. The Great Map, a unified attempt to rebuild a complete registry of all human presence in the solar system, past and present, active and abandoned. The Great Map was not perfect. It could never be perfect. But it was a symbol, a declaration that humans would try to remember. The Great Map contained millions of entries, some confirmed, some uncertain, some labeled Yeko, some labeled unknown, some labeled lost, and it was constantly updated by survey missions, by archivist ships, by drones, by trade hubs, by local networks. The Great Map became the solar system's memory. Not one memory, but a shared attempt. And in time, the archivists became a respected group, not famous like celebrities, not powerful like politicians, but respected because people understood that without archivists, the future would forget itself again. Now, we come to the final image, the final quiet ending of Earth's Forgotten Future Colonies, because the title is not only about the colonies, it is about echoes, echoes of lost worlds. Echoes are what remain when voices are gone. Imagine an archivist standing in an abandoned habitat, far in the belt. The archivist is alone. Their suit light shines softly on a corridor wall. The wall has a sign, old and faded. Maybe it says cafeteria. Maybe it says hydroponics. Maybe it says home. The archivist moves slowly because there is no rush. They float in the corridor. They stop at a small window and look out. Stars, silent, endless. The asteroid outside turns slowly. The station turns slowly. Everything is slow. Everything is calm. And the archivist finds a small plaque on the wall. Something simple. Something human. A message, scratched or printed by someone long gone. It might say, "First shift completed," or "Happy birthday, Lena," or "We made it," or "Remember Earth." And in that moment, the archivist understands that the colonies were never truly lost. Not completely, because even when a colony dies, it leaves a trace, a mark, a piece of writing, a song, a data file, a tool left on a table, a drawing, a name, and those traces are echoes. And as long as someone finds them, reads them, and remembers, the lost worlds are not entirely gone. And so, the archivist records the plaque, photographs it, uploads it, adds it to the great map, and somewhere, in a library, on Mars, or Earth, or the Moon, someone someday will read that small message and feel a quiet connection across centuries. Now, the story ends, not with a loud conclusion, but with a slow, sleepy truth. Humanity expanded. Humanity built. Humanity forgot. Humanity lost worlds. Not because of monsters. Not because of aliens. But because of distance and attention and neglect. And then, humanity remembered again. Not through heroes, but through archivists. Through boring work. Through patient mapping. Through quiet care. And if you are sleepy now, that is perfect. Because this story was designed to be slow and gentle and boring. A history, not of battles, but of maintenance and forgetting and rediscovery. So now, let your breathing slow. Let your mind drift. Let your body rest. You have reached the end of Earth's Forgotten Future Colonies. Echoes of Lost World.